Hello and welcome to today's show. I have a great guest joining me in a moment, Katherine Stewart. She's an investigative reporter. She's an author. I talked to her early on in the podcast. She covers religious liberty, politics, policy, and her latest book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, is super, super relevant. And I had an awesome conversation with her the other day. I think you are going to love it. Been a really super weird week for me for so many different reasons. Sorry if the show has been in any way discombobulated or not as hearty and robust. Working my way through things, but I will get back to it next week. Can't do it without your support. I really appreciate you guys. I love doing it. I love these conversations. Watching what is happening right now in Ukraine is absolutely heartbreaking. I think that's where so much of the world's focus is on and should be right now as a war is breaking out in Europe. I'll continue to do my best to find the best analysts, reporters, and thinkers to talk to about that, as well as everything else that we talk about here on the show. I'm looking forward to getting some new guests on, some new voices. As always, send me who you think I should have on the show. standupwithpete@gmail.com. All your email goes there, and I get it. Try to get back to as much of it as I can. All right, well, like I said, it's been a hell of a week. I'm sure for you as well. A lot of stuff going on in everybody's lives every day. I'm so glad to get a little part of yours. It is a real true honor to be able to have you listening to these conversations, supporting me and my work here in the solar-powered shed that's currently covered in snow. And it's the Friday show, and I took Thursday and went skiing with two of my best friends. Shout out to Lou Snow and Alex Cioto, who are two of the best guys I know. Always so good to me, and I love them. And we had a great time skiing, but I didn't get to talk to Christian and Ophira. And, of course, I don't do the news on Fridays, usually do the Hangouts. Anyway, 2 days without the news this week. But I promise you, I'll give you your money's worth next week if you didn't feel like we did today. You're going to love this conversation, though, with Katherine Stewart. She's the author of The Good News Club, the Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children, and like I already said, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. She's been on this beat. She's covering this beat. She actually enjoys it. She goes to all of these conservative conferences. She's covering CPAC right now. So lots to talk about. I'm really interested in her work, and I always learn so much from talking with Katherine Stewart. Great to have her back on the show. So please let her know if you're on Twitter. So many of you always do, at Kath S. Stewart, at Kath S. Stewart, Kath with a K, not a C. Katherine Stewart and I begin talking right now. Well, I've just told you all about her, and I've got her now. Katherine Stewart joins me, and I'm super excited to ask you several questions. Thank you for joining me. How are you? You made it through since we last spoke. There was a pandemic.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me back, Pete. It's great to see you again.
So I've told people about your work, the books, and recent articles, this report, but how would you best describe your over a decade covering this movement, all the most important players in it, and actually, going to these places, talking to these people? How do you describe your investigative journalism and what you've actually done?
Well, I've spent the last 10 years looking into the machinery of the movement. It's really a leadership-driven movement, and it's also organization-driven. And to understand how it works, the machinery of the movement, I've had to go to a lot of gatherings, strategy gatherings, meetings, summer summits, to really understand what's happening on the ground and to see the pieces of the network working together. So, over the past, really, it's been 13 years, I've fallen down this rabbit hole and can't get out. But I don't think you can really understand what's happening in American politics unless you understand this movement and its people.
I think that last statement is so important, and people really miss that. And even if they know it, they don't know how influential. And then once they do kind of find out, I think it might be almost politically incorrect even for progressives to talk about how influential, quote, religious people are. Do you have any thoughts on what I just said about the way that we think about it? Because I agree with you. If you don't understand how important they are and how influential they are, then you're missing a huge part of the point.
That's true. Listen, it's a movement that exploits religion for political purposes. It's not about a culture war. This is really a political war over, frankly, the future of our democracy. The movement affects every aspect of our lives from the way our courts work, our economic policy. It affects our healthcare, our education system. But more than that, it's this is not about the culture wars. Those are just sort of the shiny baubles that movement leaders get the rank and file to vote on in order to bring in the politicians that are favorable to their agenda, in order to bring in folks that are going to sort of promote court appointees that are going to give them the court decisions that they want, that are going to direct the flow of public money to their networks. And I think, it's really important to keep in mind that this is a radically anti-democratic movement. It doesn't believe in the principles of equality and pluralism that represent the best of the American promise. And we saw that on January 6th. That was the day that I would say this movement, the Christian nationalist movement, broached the surface of American politics. They played a decisive role in former President Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election.
How do you, you have a great New York Times article about this that everybody should read about exactly how they did that and how it was the kind of culmination of January 6th. But talk more specifically about your reporting on where they were with this, how they were supportive of in every way the Stop the Steal movement, if you will, which culminated, I would argue, in that day.
That's right. Well, I think they played a role in establishing the conditions that made this kind of attack on our constitutional system possible. So 3 conditions were essential in enabling the coup attempt. I think of them as the 3 Ps, okay? You've got propaganda, you've got paranoia, and a sort of fake right-wing populism. So I want to break it down because the Christian nationalist movement played a key role in establishing those 3 preconditions. The first is the creation of an information bubble where a large block of supporters can be kind of warehoused, as it were, in a state of misinformation. And the Christian nationalist movement, along with major media propaganda networks, was really successful in creating that kind of information bubble. It's a way of separating people from the facts. It makes them much more easy to control. Let's not forget that Donald Trump began to sow this, he claimed even before the election, I'm not sure I would agree with the results of an election I don't like. And, the election might be fraudulent and it's going to be stolen. And other movement leaders, I'm thinking about Michelle Bachmann, Eric Metaxas, they kind of went along with that. And after January 6th, they promoted through their networks, their radio shows and sort of video programs. Many of them promoted the idea that the election was fraudulent, or at least that there was some constitutional irregularities, things like that. So that's the propaganda piece of it. And that was absolutely huge.
Yeah, that's the first P. I want to get to the second too, but just real quick on that, my question is about the rest of us, if you will, might be reading the New York Times or WashingtonPost.com. Maybe we're watching CNN or MSNBC. Maybe we're looking at Twitter for our information. But they've curated a different feed, which doesn't include the, quote, corporate media, outlets that I mentioned, much less maybe even your Fox News. Maybe this guy or that guy's okay. But they have the YouTube podcast and they're just going to their churches. I mean, is this these guys what does that bubble specifically look like? How are they missing out on the rest of the information and facts that we're seeing to the point that they get, they become anti-vax, et cetera?
That's such an important question. I mean, let's just start with considering where the most coordinated assault on our election came from. The Council for National Policy, which, as you know, is a sort of secretive organization that connects the sort of the leadership of the movement and also a lot of big donors. They issued a statement through one of their activist arms a week before the election, calling on their allies to contest the electoral votes in the states whose outcomes they don't like. Now, members of the Council for National Policy include leaders of some of the major religious right organizations. This particular action letter was signed by nearly 24 of those leaders. And so you saw a kind of coordinated effort to cast doubt on the election. And, we can get to this a little later, but a lot of the messaging is actually disseminated through churches and through church networks. Like I have a piece in this month's New Republic where I went to an event in Chantilly, Virginia at a church. It was a kind of get out the pastors event designed to, gather a bunch of conservative pastors together give them the tools that they need to turn out their congregations and to get them to vote according to the so-called biblical values. But this event actually had an elections integrity, so-called elections integrity expert who was there really to spread a form of misinformation and lies about the election. He was a former member of the Trump administration. And boy, the whoppers that came out of his mouth.
By the way, how do you go into these conventions? You actually attend them. You talk to these people. How, at this point, don't they know you are? You've got quite a body of work. Do they let you in? Do you have to, do it kind of quietly?
Well, for the major gatherings, like I was just last month at the National Pro-Life Summit, you just buy your ticket like everybody else.
Right.
I don't have any institutional affiliations. I'm not on staff anywhere. So I just go and they're, talking about matters that are in the public interest. So when I go, I often just I just go places I'm allowed to go. And then if you look at something like CPAC, which is coming up this week, everything's online. So sometimes you really need to attend, although it's fun to go. My crazy idea of fun.
How do you have I went to CPAC several times and I would I sat in a lot of fear.
You really understand that this movement, the power of the movement, when you go to these events, you see the network in action, you see the head of, say, Heritage or Heritage Action along, having a conversation with the, folks from the Alliance Defending Freedom who are talking with Americans United for Life. I mean, you can kind of see that this is a network. It's not just, these aren't just organizations operating separately. And the thing that draws them together, look, this is a diverse movement. It's not, it includes many evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals as well. And it includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. But what you see when you go to these events is a kind of back and forth of certain kinds of messaging and certain themes. And that is what draws the movement together. They're sort of united, not so much by any theological distinctions, but more by a common political vision.
I interrupted you on after number P and we went off over here, which is fine with me because I love reading you, much less talking with you. So can we get back to that, though? What was the second P?
Sure. We could talk at persecution and paranoia.
Yeah, both.
It's really among the rank and file. I mean, the leadership really stokes that sense of persecution and directing it at their political enemies. Trump relied really heavily on the sense of grievance, and much of it was really manufactured and placed at his service by leaders of the Christian nationalist movement. I've been to events where leaders will talk about how they're engaged in a battle with tyranny against demonic forces, by which they mean their political opposition. They're frequently warning that the Bible will soon be outlawed and believers arrested in church. They cause the rank and file to believe that they're in an existential war literally against Satan. I mean, it's a really dehumanizing way to characterize people who happen to hold different political views from you or different views on religion than you do. But it's not uncommon to hear that kind of dehumanizing language. So they keep people engaged in having the sense that they're in an existential battle between absolute good and absolute evil. And, if you feel like you're in a battle against absolute evil, it really helps us understand how they justified their support for Trump. Every, support for what I would call a narcissistic sociopath with no concern for the common good. They think, well, he's a bad guy, but at least he's our guy. If you're fighting against absolute evil, you don't want the nice guy. You want the mean guy who's going to crack heads and break the rules as long as he's on your team.
That's something that a lot of people can't understand, how, if you call yourself a Christian, you could support such a terrible person who has been accused of sexually assaulting dozens of women and done all the most dishonest things you could possibly do. But you just...
The corruption of his business, the fact that even before he had to pay all these, is accused of not paying people who've worked for him over time, boasts about not paying his taxes. I mean, it's really incredible, feels no compunction about cozying up to white nationalists and other bigots.
Well, we could go on for another 10 hours, but the line in your New York Times article that I feel like really underscores the persecution P is, you write, Christian nationalism today begins with the conviction that conservative Christians are the most oppressed group in American society. Now, Catherine, I think I'm no expert on who's most oppressed, but I can think of some groups, some others who might be more persecuted, more oppressed, more discriminated against and marginalized than conservative Christians who seem to have control of entire states and schools and so much more.
Supreme Court 6-3. We've got a vastly unrepresentative Supreme Court, 6-3 conservative majority, precisely because of this movement laid the groundwork decades ago in capturing the courts. They realized that a lot of most American Christians reject the politics of division and conquest that this movement represents. Most Americans reject, religious and non-religious alike, reject their agenda. And Leonard Leo, I'm going to paraphrase him here, but there's a quote at one point where he said, our agenda is, again, paraphrasing, not popular enough to win at the ballot box. So we're going to kind of get our agenda enacted by capturing the courts. And that's what we set about doing.
And so that's exactly what Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society, did do. It's a really interesting thought that most people probably don't know is something that is cognizant, that is consciously admitted to that they are. But I guess if they think they're the minority. So that's the persecution piece. Was there another? Was there four that you had?
Yeah, kind of, populism is not quite the right word, but it sort of gets at something that this movement does, which is that they say that they've fostered the belief among this target population that the legitimacy of the United States government derives from its particular commitment to religious and cultural heritage and not from its democratic form. So I think it was really astonishing to so many of us that the leaders of the January 6th attack called themselves patriots and said, wrapped themselves in American flags. But it starts to make sense when we understand that their allegiance is to a belief in blood, earth, and religion rather than to the idea of government of the people, by the people, and for the people.
So another P could be prosperity. Can we talk about your amazing article at the New Republic, which really goes into a lot of the money that and where it comes from, that funds, you have to have money that funds this movement. And I think that, you mentioned earlier how the culture war is not really necessarily the thing. The things that I think so often we think about, LGBT rights, gay equality issues, they're constantly screaming out the trans issue, of course, abortion. But there's just a ton of money to be made by government laws, rules, regulations, and contracts. So explain to me, this is a long article. Everybody needs to read it, but tell me, kind of how you started this reporting and some of the players here that you introduced us to. These people, James and Joan Lindsay, seem fun.
Oh, yeah. So for the piece, I traveled to a church in Virginia, in Chantilly, for a presentation sponsored by a group called Faith Wins. Now, Faith Wins is one of many other organizations that targets pastors with messaging about the issues that are supposed to matter in election cycles and provides them with tools for political engagement. The event I attended was one of dozens of similar events held in swing states and reaching thousands of pastors and many hundreds of thousands of voters and congregants who could be potential voters. And the goal, again, was to persuade these pastors to turn out their congregations to vote the supposedly correct way. And the thing that was amazing, I got really interested in this topic because I was like, okay, you always want to know, follow the money, who's funding this kind of thing. And I looked into it, and it's a foundation called the
James B. Lindsay. I'm looking at the article right now.
James B. and Joan Lindsay Foundation. And they had a house there, centered in Montecito, California. Their house is for sale for $72.5 million. That's just one of their houses. He's an heir to a Pepsi fortune. I mean, he's one of the sort of families that his father was involved in the Pepsi Corporation, some aspect of it. There's probably multiple Pepsi fortunes out there, but theirs is one of them. And, you look at their tax forms and where they're donating, to which nonprofits they're donating. Remember, all these, organizations are tax-free, and it's the Family Research Council, Focus on the Family, Council for National Policy, and other kinds of religious right organizations, including Faith Wins. They put a lot of money into Faith Wins. So they were doing, they're the big sponsors. But the people who are leading Faith Wins are, folks like Chad Connolly, who is a longtime Republican Party veteran. He worked as director of faith engagement. He had a big sort of political position in South Carolina. So he's also a member of the Council for National Policy. So he's a big Republican Party operator. And then, of course, one of my favorite folks in the movement, David Barton. I call him the sort of Where's Waldo, the Christian nationalist movement, because he's everywhere. I mean, he's the sort of
we've been talking about him for years. This guy, go ahead, tell me about him and his influences at this point. He was he got in a lot of trouble when John McCain was running, because he was supposed to be, he on the McCain campaign, his like historian or something. Do I have that right? Actually, I don't know why I'm talking.
Yeah, no, it's quite all right. I mean, he is a really good example of how truth and fact and evidence are utterly irrelevant to this movement. His work as a historian of America's sort of supposedly conservative Christian origins, that work has been utterly debunked, exhaustively debunked by many historians. No one with any historical training or expertise has ever taken his work seriously. His book, The Jefferson Lies, which is one of his books in which he apparently seems to have lied about Thomas Jefferson. It was actually withdrawn by his publishing company, which is a Christian publishing house. Thomas Nelson Publishers withdrew it because they said it was lacking in matters of fact. One of his books was considered the least credible book of American history. It's voted the least credible book in American history. But that has in no way prevented him from rising to the top of this Christian nationalist world, because he tells them the stories that they want to hear. And what they want to hear is that the United States was founded as a so-called Christian nation, as they define it, founded by Christians, for Christians, and properly belongs to Christians of a supposedly biblical variety. And that's that.
Now, you wrote my question, I guess maybe the final question is, nobody needs to read the New York Times. Well, I got to ask you about this new report that you contributed to, but the New York Times piece, the New Republic piece, of course, the books, but I think the big question is the movement growing, and is it, how much of it has to do with Trump as their figurehead? You, of course, wrote The Good News Club, the Christian Right's stealth assault on America's children. So if you want to know if, a movement's growing, I think one of the best places to look is, are new people being indoctrinated into it? They, of course, think that we are indoctrinating their students into believing in CRT and all this nonsense that they keep saying. And I know you have a connection to that. So what is my question that I want to ask you, Katherine? Is the movement growing? Thank you.
Well, one thing that they are doing is it's a very sophisticated movement. Their legal strategy has become very sophisticated. They've advanced their agenda through the courts. I went to this one event where Ralph Reed, he's a longtime religious rights strategist, very, very savvy guy. He runs one of their key organizations, runs the Road to Majority Conference, Faith and Freedom. And he said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he's right about that. Look, they are a minority of our country, not a majority. But in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote in elections, and an additional number have their votes essentially stolen from them through gerrymandering, voter suppression, and other techniques that disproportionately affect voters of color and also others in Democratic-leaning districts, you don't need a majority of the population to win in election cycles. All you need is to get your people out in larger numbers. George Barna, he's an evangelical pollster. He did some really interesting research around that. He said the most devoted religious right supporters are only 10% of the population, only 10% in 2016. But they vote in 2016, 91% turned out to vote. Think about that, 91%.
Right.
And 93% of them voted for Trump. And that's the cohort that really put Trump over the edge. They're the Republican Party's most reliable slice of voters, and they do it through this machinery that really directs the rank and file to vote on a certain way. Look, they know you can control people's vote if you can get them to vote on 2 or 3 issues. And there's always these crazy culture war issues. Abortion is number 1, of course. The defense of what they see as the traditional family is number 2. But they are sort of have activated this sort of CRT nonsense and book banning and stuff in public schools precisely to draw new supporters into the rank and file and kind of reactivate a local based.
The CRT thing, we've seen this under different names, throughout the movement of conservative America. But how does that, I think some of the people at my BOE meeting who I'm arguing with are not religious at all. Do you think that they would be surprised that there is that this movement that you've covered, this right-wing evangelical Christian nationalist movement that you've covered, do you think the non-religious people who are scared of CRT and history and all these and books would be surprised to find out how much their religiosity there is underpinning this movement?
If you look at the groups, again, that are funding it or supporting it, you look at groups like Heritage Action, the Manhattan Institute, which sort of their fellow Christopher Rufo is a fellow who sort of came up with this agenda to begin with, and who they collaborate with. You can see that it's not a sort of reminds me in a way of the Tea Party in 2010, when a seemingly grassroots movement was actually funded and coordinated from the top. But look, whatever you make of the sort of excesses of whatever you might call, CRT or whatever you want to call it, the fact is that the real threat of cancel culture, the real threat of this sort of, they say CRT is racist. The real race baiting is really happening on the right. This sort of panic over CRT is inhibiting legitimate discussion of American history, or history of slavery, segregation, racial redlining, and other factors that have contributed to where we are today.
Such important work that you're doing constantly, and I hope that you keep doing it. I'm glad that you're not, that you enjoy it and that you get something out of it, because you keep going to these conferences and all of the players, and so it's such important work. But tell me about this new report, which I just lost, that you contributed to from an awesome organization that I've always been supportive of, and I can't find all the details because I'm poorly prepared. Apparently,
Baptist Joint Committee. It's a wonderful organization. They put together a report. Contributors included, and I hope I don't miss anybody: Jamar Tisby, Anthea Butler, Andrew Seidel, Andrew Whitehead, Sam Perry, Peter Manseau. Amanda Tyler, who's with the BJC, and there are probably some others as well. But it's a really terrific report looking at the role of Christian nationalism in the January 6th insurrection, or I should say attempted coup.
Freedom from Religion Foundation, Christians Against...
was involved as well.
Yeah, and a couple of other organizations. And like you said, the names that you just said, I want to try to get them all on because they all had these different contributions. But so the last question, you read about this in both the report and your New York Times article, the January 6th culminating. Where are we now? Are they all still in the tank for Donald Trump? Could they support somebody else? Where does the movement go without the Trump family and certain, I guess, members in the media? My feeling, Katherine, is Tucker Carlson will pick the next president. And I'm being serious.
Well, I can't predict the future. I would say there's a lot of support for Trump, but, some of the events I've attended recently at the National Pro-Life Summit, Mike Pence got up there and gave a speech and everybody went wild. I think that for many of the movement leaders, Trump was not their first pick. For some of them, frankly, Ted Cruz would have been a preferred candidate because same policies, but a little more, a little less messy and vulgar, right? And I think that some of the movement leaders probably still have that preference, but they will put their force behind whoever will do the deal with them and give them the policies that they want, give them the flows of public money that they want. They're a lot of what their activism is about obtaining access to public money. That's what a lot of what their attack on public education is about. a lot of what their so-called religious freedom agenda is all about, wanting to be able to claim public money for their organizations and while continuing with discriminatory practices. So, yeah, I mean, the movement long preceded Donald Trump, and it will long outlast him.
The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism is such an important book, as is all the continued reporting you're doing and contributions to this report that we just mentioned. Katherine, I can't thank you enough for joining me. I learned so much from you, and I remember our first interview, and I emailed you this, but I want to thank you for joining me then, because I was just building this podcast, and you were such a great guest and such a credible person to have on that it made me look really legitimate, and now you're doing it again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to be back.
All right. There you go. Katherine Stewart, very respected author, writer, journalist. So happy to have her on the show. Thank you so much for listening today and this week. Amazing guests all week. Long on stand-up, Andrea Chalupa and Tim Wise, Barry Ritholtz and Wajid Ali, Mara Quint, Jeff Jarvis, and Bill B. So many great guests. Thank you all very much for your support. Can't get them on without you. Can't keep the heat in the shed on without you. So please sign up to support the show at standupwithpete.com. Standupwithpete.com. Have a great weekend, and I will talk to you Monday. Take it away, John Carroll.
When you're tired of begging, saying pretty please, that's the time you gotta finally get up off of your knees. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. This is the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for loss, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.